In his new book, Foolproof, Why Safety Can Be Dangerous and How Danger Makes Us Safe, author Greg Ip examines the way our effort to minimize risks and create more safety can sometimes lead to unintended consequences, creating new and unexpected risks. And as our world and systems become increasingly complex and interconnected, this is a phenomena that's likely to increase. Is that such a bad thing? Or is it possible that what we learn when things go wrong could end up being an ultimate benefit to society? That's the focus of this edition of Rewind.
My book's called Foolproof, and it began with my own sort of exploration of how we had a global financial crisis and a little bit of a sense of guilt because I myself had been covering economics and finance for 20 years and I was completely caught unawares by the crisis. And I thought that we had actually solved most of the problems that would lead to that sort of an event. And I guess upon reflection I realized that was exactly the problem, that I and indeed many of the people that I would write about or interview had convinced themselves that we had solved all the problems and that allowed risks to grow. So that's how the book began, and I since have found similar phenomena across all aspects of the environment and technology. And I think it has interesting implications for us about how we think as a society about the notion of safety and the pluses and minuses of taking risk. Stability and a sense of safety encourage us to take more risk. Now, it may not be the case that the additional risk that we take makes us worse off, but there is a trade-off there. Eliminating one type of risk often causes a different sort of risk to reemerge somewhere else that we're actually not watching for, and that can cause a problem later on. And individuals, when they try to take care of themselves with some sort of a device or innovation or practice, they may have unintended consequences that actually put everybody else in the rest of society at risk. So these are all ways that our pursuit of safety and stability can have unintended consequences that actually achieve the opposite. Another lesson I learned was the importance of space, is that putting space between you and the source of danger is almost foolproof. Space between the water in our buildings is safer than a levee. Levees tend to collapse or get overtopped. That won't happen if you put a park on the floodplain. Space between homes and forests is safer than fire suppression. If you're up against the forest, then when the forest burns, those embers are going to land on your roof and they're going to burn your house down. Space between your house and the forest makes that less likely and also makes it less urgent to suppress the fire. Space is why flying is so safe. They call it the big sky, little airplanes. All that space around aircraft. If you're caught in turbulence and the airplane is shaken quite violently, don't worry, you're miles away from the ground. You're not going to crash. But make sure you have your seatbelt on because your head could hit the ceiling and then you'll get a skull fracture. My final lesson is that it's okay to have little disasters because that trains us to be ready and aware of the risks around us, and it makes big disasters less likely. Allowing cities to occasionally flood so they can bounce back more quickly. New York City, for example, is requiring large new buildings to take all their electrical equipment from the basement and move it up to the second floor so that the building will not be completely knocked out by the next Hurricane Sandy. Don't get an antibiotic every time you or your kid feels sick because that way you're less likely to add to the problem of resistance, and those antibiotics will be available to you and effective when you really need them. And finally, in the financial sector, let's have a system that allows the very biggest banks to fail so that we don't have to bail them out and convince people that the world is a riskless place.
Over the last century and a half, there's been a massive shift of the risk management function from the private sector, where localized knowledge and you pay for your own mistakes, to the political function, flood insurance, the Federal Reserve. You mentioned a whole series of those things. To what extent is that possibly a major factor? I don't know the trends for these various safety trends. They were getting better throughout history, but were they getting better before we politicized the risk management function? Because it seems now the major political response to any disaster is to expand the government or the socialization of risk, which seems to me one of the most dangerous things we can do.
There's also an argument to be made, a lot of this would have happened even in the absence of the government. For example, Sam Peltzman's original research on seatbelts did find that after the introduction of federal motor vehicle safety standards in the 60s, you did find a steady decline in fatalities. But what Peltzman noted was that that decline had also been in place in the 30 years before the laws came along. So it is probably the case that while federal motor vehicle standards did contribute somewhat to that decline in fatalities, most of it would have happened anyway because people naturally wanted more safety as they became more affluent. Remember, seatbelts were introduced as originally at the industry's own initiative. They were not compelled. The same with anti-lock brakes, the same with electronic stability control. A lot of the devices that keep us safe in cars today were not forced on car makers, but were actually introduced early on as options. Not all of them worked, but a lot of them did.
how do you address the psychological problems which run across the whole gamut of what you've been talking about in order to get people to recognize risk and then act to reduce it?
So the knowledge that there is something there to keep you safe actually makes you feel better. And that's not a small thing. In the Oregon medical experiment, where Oregon extended health insurance to a lot of people who are too poor to afford insurance but not qualify for Medicaid, they discovered to their dismay that people were not healthier as a result, and they spent a lot more money. But they found one important difference: a lot lower incidence of depression. And what we speculate happens is that knowing you have health insurance means you're less worried about a catastrophic illness ruining your life. So that I think there is a way to institutionalize the aviation thing of being a little bit scared, of being always aware of your surroundings. So after the Air France accident, the Flight 447 accident, there's much more emphasis on exactly this excessive trust in technology. There's an awareness that pilots almost never fly the plane themselves in difficult conditions, and when something like the conditions you described happens, they don't know what to do, or they respond the same way. So part of pilot training has become upset and prevention training, actually putting them in simulators and trying to simulate not having the devices they're supposed to have. So I call this like being a little bit scared, not being spastically scared, but being intelligently scared, and reminding yourself these little things that you can do, little basic things that are remarkably effective at removing some of the most serious risks from our lives.
For more information on the Public Engagement in an Age of Complexity project, visit wilsoncenter.org. Click the Research tab and search under the Science and Technology Innovation Program.